It was the only transcontinental railroad built without a penny of federal land grants, and yet it conquered mountains, changed the Northwest forever, and helped shape the American empire. This is the story of the Great Northern Railway, a railroad driven by vision, strategy, and sheer force of will. Built by one man's ambition, it would grow to span over 8,000 miles, link the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean, and become one of the most legendary railroads in U.S. history. Welcome back to Train Explained, the channel where we explore the most iconic locomotives, railroads, and stories that built America. Today we begin a multi-part deep dive into a line that stands apart from the rest, not just for where it went, but how it got there. This is the Great Northern Railway. Its rise, routes, engines, and enduring legacy. Let's start with the man behind the railroad, a businessman whose name is still etched into the American West. Chapter 1. The Vision of James J. Hill. The Great Northern story begins not with steel or engines, but with a man named James Jerome Hill. Born in Ontario, Canada, in 1838, Hill lost the sight in one eye as a child and had to drop out of school early. But he had something more valuable than vision. An instinct for business, an unmatched work ethic, and a deep understanding of markets and logistics. After moving to Minnesota, Hill worked in shipping, coal, and freight forwarding. He quickly noticed one thing: railroads controlled everything. In the post-Civil War era, whoever laid the rails, moved the freight, and opened the land, controlled the region's future. So in 1878, Hill and a group of investors bought a bankrupt, narrow-gauge railroad called the St. Paul and Pacific. Most investors thought it was worthless. Hill saw potential. He reorganized the company, turned it into the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railway, and within a decade, he extended it westward. By 1890, the company was renamed the Great Northern Railway, and Hill had one goal in mind: build a transcontinental railroad without the government's help. Chapter 2. Building West Hill was determined not to repeat the mistakes of other railroad barons. Unlike the Union Pacific, Central Pacific, and Northern Pacific, which relied heavily on federal land grants, Hill refused to take any. Instead, he took a slower, more methodical approach. His strategy? Build only where profitable, buy land outright and promote settlement. Keep grades low and track durable. Develop local agriculture and industry. Run trains efficiently with low costs and high reliability. It worked. Every mile of track was carefully surveyed. Grades were kept to a minimum, especially important for steam engines. Track quality was higher than average, and Hill invested heavily in bridges and infrastructure from the start. By 1893, the Great Northern reached Puget Sound, completing its St. Paul to Seattle mainline. This made it the only privately funded transcontinental railroad in U.S. history. Chapter 3. Routes and Expansion. The backbone of the Great Northern System was its St. Paul-Seattle mainline, but it was far more than just one route. Here's how the Great Northern expanded its empire. The High Line. The main route across northern Montana, including the iconic Marias Pass, which Hill's surveyors discovered in 1889. It remains the lowest crossing of the Continental Divide in the U.S. north of New Mexico. The Iron Range. In Minnesota, the Great Northern tapped into rich iron ore deposits around Duluth and Hibbing, transporting raw materials to the Great Lakes for shipping to steel mills in Chicago and Pittsburgh. Agricultural networks. Hill encouraged immigrants, particularly Scandinavian and German farmers, to settle in Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana, offering transportation, equipment, and credit. The idea was simple: settle the land, grow crops, and ship them back east. Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway, SP&S. Jointly owned with Northern Pacific, the SP&S connected eastern Washington and Oregon to the transcontinental system, opening even more access to the Pacific Northwest. Chapter 4. The Empire Builder. By the early 1900s, the Great Northern had become one of the most respected and efficient railroads in the country. Its trains were fast, its freight rates fair, and its finances remarkably stable. To reinforce its brand, Hill launched a flagship passenger train in 1929 called the Empire Builder in honor of his nickname. This wasn't just a name. It was a symbol of what Hill had built. A railroad that linked the Great Lakes to the Pacific, a path of settlement, commerce, and expansion. A corridor that transformed the Midwest and the Northwest forever. The Empire Builder would go on to become one of the most famous passenger trains in the U.S., rivaling the California Zephyr, Super Chief, and 20th Century Limited. It ran from Chicago to Seattle, using connecting lines through St. Paul, and offered amenities like domed observation cars, full dining, and stunning views of Glacier National Park. Even today, Amtrak continues to use the name Empire Builder for its long-distance service, testament to the enduring legacy of Hill's dream. Chapter 5. Glacier National Park. One of Hill's most brilliant and lasting moves was his embrace of tourism marketing. In the early 20th century, the Great Northern saw an opportunity. Promote Glacier National Park. Chapter 9. Legacy, Preservation, and the Spirit of the Great Northern. Although the Great Northern name officially disappeared in 1970 with the formation of Burlington Northern, its legacy has never truly faded. In fact, among rail fans, historians, and modelers, the GN holds a kind of mythic status, partly because of what it accomplished and partly because of what it represented. Let's look at the many ways the Great Northern continues to live on. Preserved locomotives. A handful of the Great Northern's most iconic locomotives have been preserved in museums and on heritage railroads. While none of its steam giants are operational, several survive in remarkable condition. GN2 584 S2 484 Northern, built by Baldwin in 1930. GN2 584 is preserved in Havre, Montana. It's one of the best preserved examples of GN's long-distance steam power and still wears its classic glacier green and black livery. GN 1147 H5462. Pacific on display in Wilmar, Minnesota. This locomotive served the GN in passenger service before the Streamliner era took over. GN 1355, Class H5, located in Sioux City, Iowa. This 462 was built in 1909 and is displayed at the Milwaukee Railroad Shop's Historic District. While no Great Northern steam locomotives are operational, their diesel successors are still working. Numerous EMDF units, GP9S, and even some SD9S painted in GN heritage schemes are preserved in museums and excursion operations across the U.S. Heritage Paint and Modern Tributes. Even BNSF Railway, successor to Burlington Northern and Santa Fe, has paid tribute to its Great Northern roots. In 2005, BNSF unveiled a heritage-painted SD-70 ACE numbered 1943, commemorating the creation of the GN. The locomotive wears a heritage Empire Builder scheme with inspiration drawn from the orange and green paint jobs of the GN era. Additionally, model railroad manufacturers like Athearn, Rapido, and Broadway Limited have released dozens of locomotives, rolling stock, and passenger sets in accurate GN liveries. You'll find original steam black and graphite Empire Builder orange and Pullman green, simplified post-war schemes, white Glacier Goat heralds, and even rare early Rocky the Goat circular emblems. This brand identity has had real staying power. The Great Northern in model railroading. Among model railroaders, the Great Northern is a perennial favorite. Why? Scenic territory. The GN crossed some of the most visually stunning landscapes in the U.S., from glacier-clad mountains to endless prairies. Diverse rolling stock, livestock cars, lumber flats, ore trains, and elegant streamliners. Powerful engines, from mighty Northerns to classic F units, there's a wide variety of motive power. Distinctive paint schemes, the glacier green/orange combination stands out beautifully on any layout. Entire layouts have been devoted to replicating parts of the Great Northern System, especially Marias Pass, Minot Yards, or the approach into Seattle. Whether in HO, N, or O scale, GN remains a goldmine for hobbyists who want dramatic terrain, intense operations, and a healthy dose of 20th century railroad history. Chapter 10. Marias Pass, the crown jewel. Of all the engineering feats accomplished by the Great Northern, perhaps none is as famous or important as Marias Pass. Discovered in 1889 by surveyor John F. Stevens, Marias Pass offered something Union Pacific or Northern Pacific could only dream of, a low-grade crossing of the Continental Divide. Why Marias Pass mattered: elevation, only 5,213 feet compared to Sherman Hill, 8,014 feet, or the Bozeman Pass, 5,760 feet length. The grade was longer but gentler, averaging 1.8% or less year-round access, fewer snow closures, and easier snow management than other mountain passes. Beauty. It offered stunning access to what would become Glacier National Park. Today, Marias Pass remains a key transcontinental artery for BNSF. Freight trains, and Amtrak's Empire Builder, still run the very rails Hill carved through the Rockies, over bridges, and through tunnels that have been upgraded but never abandoned. Chapter 11. Empire Builder's Legacy. We mentioned the Empire Builder train earlier, but its story deserves a deeper look. First launched in 1929, the Empire Builder was the flagship passenger service of the Great Northern. It was designed to compete with the finest trains in the nation and serve as a mobile marketing campaign for the Pacific Northwest. Empire Builder highlights: first-class service with Pullman cars and lounges. Observation domes added in the 1950s passed through St. Paul, Fargo, Minot, Glacier National Park, Spokane, and into Seattle, Portland. Iconic streamlined EMD-F units pulled the train in the post-war era. In the golden age of rail travel, the Empire Builder offered scenic luxury, and for many, it was the first and only way they ever saw the Rockies. When Amtrak took over passenger rail in 1971, the Empire Builder was one of the few names retained. It remains in operation today, carrying tens of thousands of riders each year, many still in awe of the views that James J. Hill once promised his passengers more than a century ago. Chapter 12. The Cascade Tunnel. Another engineering marvel that showcases the ambition of the Great Northern is the Cascade Tunnel in Washington State. To connect the Great Northern to the Puget Sound and the ports of Seattle, Hill had to punch through the Cascade Mountains. The result? Two major tunnels. Original Cascade Tunnel, 1900, 2.6 miles long New Cascade Tunnel, 1929, 7.8 miles long, still the longest railroad tunnel in the U.S. today. The 1929 tunnel was a marvel of its time. Steam locomotives couldn't run inside it without suffocating the crew, so the GN installed electric locomotives to move trains through the tunnel. Later, as diesel-electric engines took over, ventilation systems replaced the electric fleet. Even today, the tunnel is critical for BNSF and Amtrak operations across the Cascades. It's a direct example of how the Great Northern built for the long term and built to last. Chapter 13. The man behind it all, James J. Hill. We've talked a lot about railroads, but we must return to the man who made it all possible, James J. Hill, known as the Empire Builder. Hill was no ordinary tycoon. While figures like Vanderbilt and Gould focused on monopolies and quick profits, Hill was obsessed with efficiency, engineering, and development. He believed a railroad could only thrive if the land around it thrived. That meant helping farmers improve yields, financing equipment and seed, encouraging immigration and town building, maintaining a disciplined, debt-free financial strategy. Hill's attention to detail was legendary. He would personally inspect track work, demand financial reports down to the penny, and fire managers who underperformed. Yet, he was respected, not just feared. He died in 1916. But not before completing his dream of a transcontinental railroad without land grants, a feat no one else achieved. His legacy lives on not just in steel and timber, but in every community the Great Northern helped build. Chapter 14. Community Impact. From its earliest days, the Great Northern didn't just move freight, it moved people and created places, towns and cities. Many towns across Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, and Washington owe their founding, or growth, to GN depots and junction points. Cities like Minot, North Dakota, a major division point and yard, Havre, Montana, with a Great Northern diesel shop and museum, Everett, Washington, port terminal and industrial access, Fargo, North Dakota, key interchange. The railway helped define settlement patterns across the northern plains. Agricultural development hills pushed to develop farmland led to a farming boom in wheat, barley, and livestock. He brought in Swedish, Norwegian, and German immigrants, often providing promotional materials and shipping deals to make the move easier. Grain elevators, stockyards, and milling operations followed, fueling the Midwest's transformation into the breadbasket of America. Schools and institutions Hill's wealth and influence also extended to philanthropy. He donated to libraries, schools, and hospitals, including institutions in St. Paul and Seattle. The Great Northern, in many ways, was more than a business. It was a force for regional development. Chapter 15, Dieselization, the End of Steam and the Rise of EMD. By the late 1940s, the era of steam was winding down, and the Great Northern was at the forefront of modernization. Unlike some railroads that clung to steam longer than necessary, GN moved aggressively to dieselize its roster, and in doing so, it became one of the most forward-thinking railroads in America. One of the key figures in this transition was Frank J. Gavin, who became president of the GN after World War II. He understood that diesel locomotives offered better availability, easier maintenance, and lower long-term costs. The days of fueling, watering, servicing fireboxes, and dealing with round-the-clock maintenance were over. Key benefits of dieselization for GN: reduced crew sizes, faster turnaround times, consistent horsepower delivery at all altitudes, no water stops, crucial in arid regions of Montana and North Dakota. The GN began purchasing diesel locomotives as early as 1941, starting with EMDFT units, and after the war, they doubled down. Chapter 16, F units and freight dominance. The workhorse of the early GN diesel fleet was the EMDF unit, especially the FT, F3, and F7 models. These covered fast freight, manifest runs, and even some passenger assignments in transitional periods. You'd commonly see long sets of ABBA F-unit lash-ups grinding up the mountains with ore trains, wheat hoppers, or general freight. Some details: FT units began service in the early 1940s, proving diesel's capabilities. F3 and F7s were added through the late 40s and early 50s. The GN used its own shops, like those in Hilliard, Spokane, to maintain and repaint them. Paint schemes ranged from the early black and gold freight livery to the iconic, simplified Empire Builder scheme in orange, green, and yellow. Chapter 17, Passenger Diesel Power. The Great Northern also invested heavily in diesel power for its passenger services. By the late 1950s, virtually all mainline passenger runs were diesel-hauled. Key passenger diesels: EMDE 7s and E9s. Streamlined beauties designed for top-tier trains like the Empire Builder Alco PAs. Some of the most stylish locomotives ever built, used on the Western Star and other secondary services, EMD GP7s and GP9s, occasionally used on local passenger runs or mail services. The Empire Builder, of course, was the crown jewel. Watching an ABA lash-up of F units, or E units, thunder across the Rockies, pulling a 14-car passenger consist was a sight and sound to behold. Chapter 18, The SD9 and Road Switcher Revolution. As the 1950s progressed, GN, like many roads, moved toward road switchers, locomotives that could handle both road freight and switching duties. Enter the EMDSD9, nicknamed the Cadillac of first-generation six-axle power. GN rostered dozens of SD9s, most delivered in 1956 to 1959. They were ideal for mountain grades thanks to their tractive effort. You'd often find them working ore trains out of Iron Range country or slugging it out over Marias Pass. Many of these SD9s remained in service into the 1980s under Burlington Northern, testament to their durability and GN's smart procurement. Chapter 19. Second-generation diesels. In the 1960s, GN adopted newer second-gen diesels with turbochargers, dynamic braking, and higher horsepower. Notable models: EMDG P35s and GP35s, sleek, powerful, and good for fast freight. EMD SDP 45s and SDP 45s, used for passenger services. Longer frames to accommodate steam generators. EMD SD 45s. 3,600 horsepower monsters that became the pride of the GN fleet. The SD 45s, in particular, were key to GN's later years. These long, aggressive-looking locomotives had flared radiators and could lead the heaviest transcontinental freight consists. They defined GN's final decade of independence. Chapter 20. Operations in the 1960s. By the 1960s, the Great Northern was running like a well-oiled machine. It had a modern diesel roster, streamlined passenger services, despite declining ridership, a powerful marketing campaign aimed at tourism and Pacific trade, efficient classification yards in Minot, Havre, and St. Paul strong, interchange relationships with the CB and Q, SP and S, and NP. But change was coming. Passenger revenues were falling, interstate highways and air travel were hurting business. Mergers were on the horizon. Chapter 21. The push for merger. James J. Hill had long dreamed of a transcontinental rail empire, and even in death, that vision persisted. By the 1960s, the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle all worked closely together. Executives recognized that a merger would reduce redundancies, create a more efficient network, offer stronger competition to roads like Union Pacific and Santa Fe. However, the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, had blocked past merger attempts over antitrust concerns. It wasn't until 1970, after years of legal wrangling, that the merger was approved. Chapter 22. Birth of the Burlington Northern. On March 2, 1970, the Great Northern ceased to exist, at least in name. The Burlington Northern Railroad was formed, combining Great Northern Northern Pacific, CB, and QSP and S. The new system stretched from Chicago to Seattle, with branches reaching Texas, the Twin Cities, and even into Canada. What changed? Locomotives were repainted into Cascade green with black noses. Passenger services were handed over to Amtrak in 1971. BN focused heavily on coal, grain, and intermodal growth. The Great Northern's old logo, the Mountain Goat, was retired, replaced by the BN Cascade logo. Though fans mourned the loss of GN's branding, many employees and rail historians recognized that the merger was necessary for survival. Chapter 23. GN's influence on BN and BNSF. Even within the BN and later BNSF, the DNA of the Great Northern never disappeared. How? Track design. Much of BN's most reliable trackage, especially across the Northern Corridor, came from GN's investment in grades, bridges, and right-of-way yard locations. Key hubs in Havre, Minot, and St. Paul remained essential corporate culture. GN had long prized operational efficiency and conservative financing, both traits inherited by BN, and in 1996, when BN merged with the Santa Fe, the new company, BNSF Railway, became the second largest railroad in North America. Chapter 24. Revival of the Empire Builder. Despite Amtrak taking over passenger service in 1971, the Empire Builder continued its run. Today, it still follows much of the original GN route from Chicago to Milwaukee, St. Paul, Fargo, Minot, Havre, Whitefish, Spokane, and then splitting to Seattle and Portland. It remains one of Amtrak's busiest long-distance trains, carrying passengers through breathtaking mountain vistas, historic towns, and across the same steel rails once trod by steam and diesel legends. Modern rail fans and passengers alike still refer to it by its full name, the Empire Builder. Chapter 25. Surviving Equipment. While much GN equipment has been scrapped or repainted, there are gems still out there. Locomotives. As mentioned earlier, GN 2584 in Havre, Montana, is a beautifully preserved S2 Northern Several G N painted SD, 9S, and F units are preserved in museums or short lines across the U.S. rolling stock. Heritage passenger cars survive in tourist railroads or private charter services. Cabooses, boxcars, and ore cars pop up in museums and photo charters from time to time. In 2005, BNSF painted SD 70 ACE number 9297 in GN heritage colors, an acknowledgement of the past on a locomotive built for the future. Chapter 26. Famous Accidents and Incidents. Even the best-run railroads aren't immune to tragedy, and the Great Northern experienced its share of accidents, disasters, and close calls over its 70-plus-year existence. While known for its efficiency, GN operated across dangerous terrain, steep grades, icy mountain passes, deep canyons, and remote prairies. Combine this with primitive early signaling systems and mechanical limitations, and you had a recipe for potential disaster. Notable incidents: Wellington Avalanche, 1910. Though technically before the GN fully adopted the Great Northern name, the Wellington Avalanche is deeply tied to its history. On March 1, 1910, 2 passenger trains were trapped near the Cascade Tunnel in Washington due to a massive snowstorm. After days of being stranded, a catastrophic avalanche buried the trains, killing 96 people, making it one of the worst rail disasters in American history. The tragedy prompted GN to build snow sheds, increase tunnel safety, and eventually push for a new Cascade Tunnel, which we'll talk about later. Derailments on Marias Pass. With its winding curves and steep gradients, Marias Pass was the site of numerous minor derailments, especially during winter. Frozen switches, brake failures, and rock slides made it one of the most challenging routes to maintain. Boiler explosions and runaways. In the steam era, boiler explosions weren't uncommon, especially if pressure wasn't carefully monitored. One such incident in the 1920s resulted in a locomotive crew being severely burned after a safety valve failed. Chapter 27. The Great Northern in Wartime. The Great Northern Railway played a critical role in both world wars, moving massive volumes of troops, tanks, aircraft parts, munitions, and raw materials across the country. In World War I, Great Northern was nationalized under the United States Railroad Administration, USRA, from 1917 to 1920. This was an effort to centralize logistics during wartime. While this disrupted operations slightly, GN's efficiency stood out, even in a system-wide merger. In World War II, GN was even more vital. Its Pacific routes allowed movement of goods to West Coast ports supporting the Pacific Theater. Key contributions: transported iron ore from Minnesota to steel plants, hauled grain and beef to support soldiers overseas, ran troop trains to and from bases across the Northwest, carried aircraft frames and engines from inland factories to coastal bases. The Great Northern earned a reputation during World War II for its punctuality and reliability, even with increased wartime loads. Chapter 28. Signature Trains. Beyond the famous Empire Builder, the GN operated several other named trains that served various communities and travelers across the Northwest. The Western Star, introduced in 1951, the Western Star was a secondary transcontinental service that complemented the Empire Builder. It offered more local stops and carried mail and express freight. Though not as luxurious, it provided essential connectivity to smaller towns. The Oriental Limited. Before the Empire Builder took center stage, the Oriental Limited was GN's flagship service from 1905 to 1929. Its name reflected Hill's dream of linking Chicago to trade routes in Asia. The train ran from Chicago to Seattle, then passengers could connect to steamships bound for Japan, China, and the Philippines. The fast mail GN also ran high-speed mail trains, vital to communities dependent on rail for correspondence and commerce. These trains weren't just about getting from point A to B. They were about speed, reliability, and national integration. Chapter 29. Infrastructure Innovations. One thing that set the Great Northern apart was its infrastructure investment. James J. Hill was obsessed with building a railroad that would last, not just get built quickly. This ethos persisted well into the 20th century. Key projects: Cascade Tunnel, original and new. The original Cascade Tunnel, completed in 1900, was over 2.6 miles long and essential to crossing the Cascade Range. But ventilation issues and steep grades caused delays. So in 1929, GN completed the new Cascade Tunnel, a 7.8-mile bore that remains the longest railroad tunnel in North America to this day. Marias Pass Engineering. GN's route over Marias Pass remains a marvel. Rather than use switchbacks or helper stations, the GN carved a gradual and direct grade through dense wilderness. Bridge building. Dozens of steel trestles and viaducts, many still in use today, were engineered to withstand ice, flooding, and heavy loads. Yard design. Terminals in Hilliard, Washington, Minot, North Dakota, St. Paul, Minnesota, and Havre, Montana, featured forward-thinking classification yards, diesel shops, and fueling facilities. Hill once said, "Give me snow sheds, tunnels, steel bridges, whatever it takes." That legacy shows. Chapter 30. Company Culture and Branding. The Great Northern wasn't just a business, it was a brand. It projected an image of rugged strength, frontier grit, and dependability. And that image was backed by strong internal culture. The Rocky Mountain Goat, first introduced in the 1920s, the White Mountain Goat became GN's iconic logo. It symbolized agility, strength, and the ability to thrive in harsh terrain. It was often seen on locomotive nose heralds, station signage, timetables, and advertisements, employee uniforms. To this day, the goat remains one of the most beloved railroad logos ever created. Employee loyalty. The GN fostered strong employee pride. Workers were trained well, compensated fairly, and retained longer than industry averages. The railroad also built company towns like Hilliard and Essex, housing and recreation centers for workers' education and safety programs long before they were standard. Chapter 31. Tourism and the National Parks. Few railroads embraced tourism like the Great Northern. Realizing that scenic destinations meant ticket sales, GN worked hand in hand with the National Park Service to promote Glacier National Park, nicknaming it the American Alps. Key initiatives: built Swiss-style chalets and lodges in and around Glacier, marketed tours to international and East Coast tourists, offered Rail Plus hotel packages, including meals and guided hikes, designed rail schedules specifically to align with park visit times. Posters and brochures from the 1920s to 1940s depicted majestic peaks, mirror lakes, and stately trains pulling up to pristine lodges. Many of these pieces are now collectible works of art. GN helped make Glacier a household name, and tourism became a stable off-season revenue stream. Chapter 32. The Great Northern in Pop Culture. While the GN may not have the mainstream fame of Union Pacific or Santa Fe, it still appeared in film, literature, and media throughout the 20th century. Notable mentions: North by Northwest, 1959. The climax of Hitchcock's thriller takes place on a GN passenger train heading toward Chicago. Ernest Hemingway referenced GN in some of his early letters and short stories. Railroad art by Howard Fogg and Griff Teller included majestic paintings of GN locomotives in mountain passes. Today, model railroaders, train sim users, and railfan YouTubers keep the Great Northern alive in digital and miniature form. Chapter 33. Railroading in the Modern West. Though the Great Northern no longer exists, its physical and spiritual legacy lives on, especially under BNSF Railway, which still operates the transcontinental route it pioneered. What remains today, the High Line between St. Paul and Seattle, is still a major freight artery. Amtrak's Empire Builder continues daily service over the former GN route. Freight trains still cross Marias Pass daily, hauling containers, grain, and oil. Several GN depots, bridges, and tunnels are still in active use. Whether it's a double-stack intermodal train racing across North Dakota or a long grain drag climbing toward Glacier Park, you're watching the Great Northern's blueprint in motion. Chapter 34. Preservation and Legacy Railfans. Historians and preservation groups have worked hard to ensure the Great Northern's legacy is remembered. Preserved equipment: steam locomotive GN2584 S2 Northern, static display in Havre, MTE-MDF units, and GP9S in museums like the Lake Superior Railroad Museum, passenger cars in service on tourist railroads across the Midwest and Pacific Northwest museums, Great Northern Railway Historical Society, GNRHS, hosts events, publishes books, and maintains archives Whitefish Depot Museum. Restored GN Depot with artifacts, models, and photos. Railroad museums in St. Paul, Duluth, and Seattle all pay tribute. Thanks to these efforts, new generations are discovering the story of a railroad that helped build the American Northwest. Chapter 35. A locomotive gallery of GN's greatest engines. If you want to understand a railroad's soul, look at the locomotives it trusted. The Great Northern operated one of the most diverse, forward-thinking, and efficient rosters in American railroading history. From pioneering steam to first-gen diesels, these were the workhorses and showpieces of the GN Steam Stars. Class H4 Mikado 282. A staple in freight service, the H4 class was versatile and powerful, especially over tough grades. GN's Mikados were often equipped with oil or coal firing, depending on regional resources, and were used for everything from ore drags to livestock. Class P2 Mountain 4-8-2. Built by Baldwin in the 1920s, the P2 class was GN's flagship passenger steam locomotive. These elegant mountains could haul the Empire Builder over mountain ranges and do so at speed. They were smooth, dependable, and beautifully proportioned, with long tenders for sustained runs. Class 08, Consolidation 280. This humble freight engine helped open up the frontier. Often seen on branch lines or in helper duty, the 08s could dig in and pull like champs in the snow-heavy, mountainous terrain of the Northwest. Class S2 Northern 484, GN's biggest and baddest steam locomotives, these 4-8-4S were high-horsepower beasts. They hauled heavy passenger trains over long distances without needing helpers, especially post-1930. Locomotive 2584, an S2, is preserved in Havre, Montana today. Transition to diesel. The Great Northern wasn't afraid to lead the charge into dieselization, starting in the 1940s and ramping up fast. EMD-FT. The original diesel revolutionaries, GN was one of the first to embrace the EMD-FT freight units, which featured dynamic braking, smoother operation, and lower maintenance than steam. F units, F3, F7, F9. Painted in that iconic green, orange, and gold Empire Builder livery, these cab units became synonymous with GN passenger trains in the 1950s. Sleek and powerful, they were the public face of post-war modernity. GP7 and GP9 road switchers. A backbone of GN freight ops, these versatile diesels could switch cars in a yard by morning and pull a manifest freight by night. The GP9s especially were trusted for their stamina and reliability. SD-45. With 3,600 horsepower and 6-axle traction, GN's SD-45s were a freight powerhouse introduced in the late 60s. These were mountain-grade monsters, used heavily in ore and intermodal service. Chapter 36. GN's Role in Railroading Innovation. James J. Hill's vision wasn't just about building a railroad, it was about improving the very science of railroading. That innovation carried on for decades. Strategic route design. Unlike other transcontinentals, Hill's GN was built without government land grants, meaning every mile had to be profitable. That led to smarter routing, efficient alignments, and lower construction costs. It was the only transcon built entirely with private funds, a bold gamble that paid off. Modular Engineering GN pioneered modular bridge and tunnel construction, especially in mountain territory. Rather than overbuild, they used temporary timber structures until traffic warranted steel upgrades. This flexible, scalable mindset became a model for later railroads. Early radio and remote tech GN was among the first to experiment with radio dispatching in the 1940s and later supported remote-controlled switches and signaling systems, especially on major freight corridors. Intermodal and container use. Even before the term intermodal became industry buzz, GN was testing piggyback flat cars, allowing trucks to be loaded directly on rail cars, decades before it became standard. Chapter 37. Timeline highlights. Let's take a rapid-fire look at some of the key moments in the Great Northern's rich timeline. 1856. St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, chartered the earliest ancestor to GN, begins as a small regional line in Minnesota. 1889. James J. Hill forms the Great Northern Railway. By merging smaller lines and expanding westward, Hill creates a new northern transcontinental route. 1893 Empire Builder route completed to Seattle. The Pacific Northwest is linked via rail with the Great Lakes and Chicago beyond. 1900 First Cascade Tunnel completed, a 2.6-mile tunnel under Washington's mountains revolutionizes year-round service. 1910 Wellington avalanche kills 96, a sobering disaster that sparks new snow protection and tunnel plans. 1929 New Cascade Tunnel opens. At 7.8 miles, it becomes the longest tunnel in North America. 1930s Modern passenger service upgrades. GN unveils streamlined trains, lounge cars, and scenic domes. 1955 Full dieselization achieves steamboats out as EMDs and GEs take over the roster. 1970 GN merges into Burlington Northern A. Historic merger creates one of the largest freight systems in the world. Chapter 38. The Final Days. Despite its efficiency and loyal customer base, the Great Northern couldn't remain independent forever. In the late 1960s, the railroad industry faced declining passenger revenues, increased trucking competition, costly regulations, redundant overlapping routes. GN joined forces with the Northern Pacific, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway to form the Burlington Northern in March 1970. Though the GN name disappeared from timetables, its infrastructure, employees, and identity lived on within BN, and later BNSF. Many GN routes were retained due to their high efficiency. The Empire Builder train, for example, survived under Amtrak using the same scenic alignment. The GOAT logo may have faded, but the legacy didn't. Chapter 39. Why the Great Northern Still Matters. So, why does the Great Northern matter today? Because it represents a rare blend of vision, execution, and endurance. It wasn't built by government decree. It wasn't handed land or subsidies. It wasn't patched together by speculation. It was planned, mile by mile, to succeed by a man who understood markets, engineering, and people. Its route still moves the economy. Its locomotives are still studied. Its stations are still standing. And its legend still grows. The Great Northern wasn't just a railroad. It was a blueprint for how infrastructure should be built, responsibly, intelligently, and boldly. Chapter 40. How GN stacked up against other transcontinentals. When you compare the Great Northern to its fellow transcontinental railroads, the differences are stark and revealing. Union Pacific built earlier and with significant land grants, the UP focused on linking Omaha with California via the original Golden Spike route. It was well capitalized, but its alignment involved high grades and desert routes that GN largely avoided. Southern Pacific, while SP was a southern powerhouse, it struggled with intense heat, sharp curves, and often politically entangled finances. GN's route was colder, yes, but also more direct, better engineered, and built to a modern standard from day one. Northern Pacific, technically a sister to the GN after the BN merger, the NP actually predated GN's westward expansion. But while the NP often followed rivers and less efficient paths, GN's route was more surgically laid, chosen based on gradient, commerce, and strategic forecasting. Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe ATSF was famous for its passenger experience, but less efficient for long-haul freight. GN balanced both worlds, efficient freight handling and top-tier passenger service, especially with the Empire Builder. In short, GN wasn't just one of many. It was the smartest-built transcontinental. Others had political muscle. GN had mathematical precision and a visionary at the helm. Chapter 41. The Great Northern Lives On, through BNSF. Though the Great Northern name officially ended in 1970, its spirit and its tracks live on today. Burlington Northern Merger, 1970. On March 2, 1970, the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and Spokane, Portland, and Seattle railways merged to form Burlington Northern, a consolidation that reshaped Western railroading. This wasn't the end, it was evolution. GN's best routes, equipment, and terminals became cornerstones of the BN network. BNSF formation, 1995. In 1995, Burlington Northern merged with Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe to become BNSF Railway, now one of the largest and most powerful freight railroads in the world. And guess what? Many of BNSF's most profitable and heavily used lines today are ex-Great Northern main lines. From Seattle to Minneapolis, across Montana and the Dakotas, the Hill lines continue to carry thousands of tons of cargo each day. Whether it's coal, grain, intermodal containers, or Amtrak's Empire Builder, the bones of the Great Northern are alive and well. Chapter 42. Where to see GN's legacy. Today, if you're a rail fan, there are still plenty of places to feel the magic of the Great Northern Railway. Empire Builder route, Amtrak. Today's Empire Builder passenger train follows the original GN route across the Rockies and through the vast plains. It's one of Amtrak's most scenic long-distance services and a living tribute to GN's legacy. Preserved locomotives GN2584, a beautiful S2 Northern 484, preserved in Havre, Montana. GN1147, a sturdy GP9 diesel at the Lake Superior Railroad Museum. GN1355, a preserved 462 Pacific at Sioux City. Historic depots, St. Paul Union Depot, one of GN's grandest stations, beautifully restored. Whitefish, Montana Depot, still in use today by Amtrak, filled with GN history. Fargo, North Dakota Depot, a picturesque relic of GN's influence in the upper Midwest. James J. Hill House, St. Paul, Minnesota. Once the home of GN's founder, this opulent mansion is now a public museum operated by the Minnesota Historical Society. It tells the story, not just of a man, but of a movement. Chapter 43. Final Thoughts. Why the Great Northern Endures. The Great Northern Railway was more than a business. It was a strategic marvel, a geographic miracle, and a testament to visionary leadership. It wasn't just built, it was engineered for success. It didn't just haul freight. It moved an entire region forward. It didn't need government help. It proved the private sector could achieve greatness. From prairie towns to snow-capped peaks, the GN stitched together a vast and challenging landscape and made it profitable, livable, and connected. Even in a world of mega mergers, high-speed rail, and AI-driven logistics, there's something enduring about the goat on the nose of a green and orange F unit thundering west. The Great Northern wasn't just a railroad, it was an idea. And ideas, when forged in steel and sweat, never really fade. Outro. Train Explained. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the history of the Great Northern Railway. If you enjoyed this multi-part deep dive, please hit that like button, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. What's your favorite Great Northern moment or memory? Have you ever ridden the Empire Builder or seen a GN locomotive up close? We'd love to hear your stories. Until next time, keep your eyes on the rails, and remember, some legacies are built to last.